Okay, should we move on to planting on and around buildings and the provision of bird and bat boxes, for example, and should we require features that enhance biodiversity?
I mean, again, we've got areas of deficiency that have been identified, areas of deficiency in local access to a borough or metropolitan level site of importance for nature conservation. And again, I guess we can come back and say, should we require these sort of interventions everywhere? Are there specific spaces, for example, areas that are deficient in existing wildlife, or even near existing important wildlife areas to sort of create corridors and those sorts of things. So any sort of suggestions that you have about to what degree should we be requiring these things from developments?
Could I look at my fellow councillors who sit on planning? Do we at the moment in our planning reports have a report on biodiversity when it comes to planning applications? I think there's something, but I'm not sure how much it tells us.
On relevant applications, so maybe the applicant has put forward a green roof or a green wall, or so then there'll be a comment on biodiversity.
But if a smallish development comes forward of less than 0.4 hectares, are we told about the biodiversity on a particular site at the moment?
We are told if there are bats.
Yes.
If there's features that are of ecological value, so say if there's mature trees on site, then there's certain circumstances where we'd ask the applicant to produce a bat survey, or so there is certain circumstances where we would know
so
what biodiversity was there.
TPO trees, bats, what else would we get in our biodiversity report?
If there were trees and hedges on site, if there was any historical evidence of important species on site, we'd find out more about that.
And do people generally feel that would be enough information for a planning application to come before a committee?
Could you encourage people to use building materials which would encourage them to nest? Because there are now these ready-made bricks.
Yeah.
So that if you're going to have an extension, whether it be a garage extension or a flat roof or a green roof, you could use some of the ready-made bird bricks.
Right. Elizabeth, then Ruth.
One of the things I know our subcommittee on planning has been very concerned about is the depth of soil on some of these underground extensions, which I think can go down 2/3 of the garden under the October 2008 regulations coming out from government. And if you sort of take away the garden, which was lovely and had umpteen feet of topsoil, and then you replace 2 or 3 floors with a swimming pool and all the rest of it, but then only put 3 foot of earth on the top, you can only sort of really put very slender bushes, and it will have to support a sort of completely different set of birds, bees and what have you. And I think this is a real worry to us.
It's certainly come up in some of our other workshops, the issue of basement excavation. Certainly at the council, we don't feel that 3 foot of soil is sufficient to encourage any sort of biodiversity, and that's one of the reasons that we're looking to move policy to try and control basement development. Certainly, I mean came out of an appeal, as you're probably aware, that we lost, and we're going to keep fighting.
Could we not ask for considerably more than 3 foot then at this meeting?
I think at the first instance we'd ask that there was some sort of control for all sorts of reasons on the basement. That was certainly what came out of the other meeting, that there's also issues of water attenuation, for example, the water runoff, and also light pollution came out as a key problem with basement excavations. But I think as well 3 foot of soil is definitely not sufficient, particularly the idea of filling your entire garden with the basement development is something that we don't think is acceptable.
Judging by the agenda, we're not really going to get onto the subject of trees unless we do it now.
I think we are doing it now.
Well, that's fine. Because what bothers me about trees is that some people love them and some people hate them. And it's the people who hate them who are the trouble in Westminster, because they can't wait to take them down. our neighbour here was talking about the enclosures behind terraced houses. That was a real problem when I lived in a terrace, and Mr. Akers tries very hard to get people to say, if you take one down, you've got to put another one in. But it doesn't work because the person concerned doesn't bother. But the other point that matters is, for example, Westminster likes to have plane trees all along the Thames, and they look beautiful. People then start saying, I can't see the river for the trees, so send somebody along to cut them down. And every 2 years, so far to my knowledge, he has people clambering around in the trees, taking a lot out of them. Now, if you look at somewhere like the park along Grosvenor Road, the plane trees are a tremendous trunk, probably 60 feet high, before there's any green at all. And this business of cutting down the trees when they're only, say, 10 years old, just makes them into larger bushes. And I don't know how we get that idea over, but to my mind it's a pity to ruin the tree for the future by tackling it like that. He tells me also, too, the reason people say that they can have these trees cut is because where there's traffic on a road, he's more or less obliged to take out whatever is overhanging the road to the point of hitting a bus or whatever. But that is only for a specific reason. The reason that people can't see through them is a terrible reason for saying that they want them destroyed or mutilated.
All right, Ruth.
Just a couple of two quick things. I think there may be a slight tendency for people, but I'm trying to encourage as far as we possibly can in the current regime, sustainability of all kinds in terms of design, materials and all sorts. There is a bit of a tendency to find that you've got the offer of a sedum roof, a bat box and bird friendly bits and pieces as a way of convincing us that it's really, really a green development, and we're not convinced. So I just feel that anything that's put forward as being genuine, being green, has got to be genuinely green. And the second thing I'd say is that actually, if you're talking about extensions to a private home, you've got to think a bit carefully about bats in particular, because it's not everybody's cup of tea, and there are some reasons why that might be the case. I think probably most people can sort of bear sort of birds, but I mean, not everybody can be. You have to be a bit careful of what you're asking of individual families, I think, in this circumstance.
Ruth, there is another workshop on sustainability. Has that already taken place?
No,
I
it's
can't.
coming up.
It's coming up. What's the date of
It's
that?
this Thursday evening, I believe.
And that's going to be covering sustainability in buildings. Yes, so it will cover off a lot of these points. Elizabeth?
We found this last year in the summer, when we had an attempt to drive down the fear of crime figures, that a lot of the trees with large canopies were actually obscuring street lights. This was, Paul Akers came up with me, and we spent a lot of time looking at it, again with Dave Knight, the lighting expert. And that it's an issue not just for Westminster, but particularly in private gardens, where people really don't look at the situation, and the lamps seem to have been put in places which unfortunately conflict with trees, and vice versa.
Okay, the gentleman over there, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
It's Paul Simmons from the Planning Enforcement Team. Just
right.
One very quick point. I've recently had dealings with Paul Akers over a site at the back of a very large building, a very difficult environment to grow plants. And there was a planting obligation on the developer. It was a big institution in Portland Place to screen a large amount of air conditioning units. Now, the solution finally adopted on Mr. Akers' advice was high-quality artificial planting, which might sound a bit grim, but in fact I've been to see it, and it was excellent. In its place, artificial planting, where natural planting, as other contributors have suggested, simply will not be maintained and will die. There is a niche for it, and we have used it, and it seemed to be